for 1,000 years. What other 1,000-year reference is there in the doctrine? While Jesus is reigning for 1,000 years, saints will reign with him. That Satan will be bound as well for that 1,000 years. That's the idea behind that teaching, is those things are literal. Jesus will literally be reigning in Jerusalem. Satan will literally be bound and held back from the earth. And we talked about how all of these things were centered around the idea that Jesus came to establish the kingdom but couldn't do it. He failed. Man stopped him. While he was trying to establish that kingdom, men killed him before he could do it. So at some point in the future, he's going to have to come back. He's going to have to come back and finish what he started. We talked about historical premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism. Very similar to each other. Dispensational brought the idea of those 7 time periods that time was divided up in. It also brought the idea of the rapture, was separate from the historical. So we talked last week about kind of the foundations of the teaching, and we fleshed it out, talked about kind of what it taught, what it was all about. Tonight we're really going to talk more about breaking it down. What makes it false? How do we know that it's false? We started talking about this last week at the end of class, so you'll probably remember some of this, but we're going to cover it again. First question that we would have to ask somebody who is teaching this doctrine: did Jesus come 2,000 years ago to establish his kingdom? And did he establish the kingdom at that time? Well, premillennialist teaches no, that he did not establish it at that time. He was killed before he could. He failed to establish the kingdom. That's what that doctrine teaches. Did Jesus fail? Are we going to teach that Jesus failed, that God could not carry out his plan? This is a terrible misinterpretation of our Bibles, a terrible misinterpretation of both Jesus' mission while he was here on earth 2,000 years ago, and a terrible misinterpretation of the nature of the kingdom of God. Do you have a comment? That's a great question, and we'll get to that in just a second. Those people are claiming that Jesus did not establish the kingdom while he was here. The kingdom has not yet been established. They claim that Jesus is going to return later to establish that kingdom here on earth. We've got some problems with that as we look throughout the rest of our Bible. Ephesians 1 tells us that Jesus is placed in the heavenly realms. He reigns in heavenly realms, not here on earth. John 18, when Jesus stood before Pilate, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, if I was here to try to establish a kingdom here on earth, people would be fighting for me to stay alive." But that's not what was happening. He told them, my kingdom was spiritual. Jesus made it very clear in his teaching to everyone he spoke to about the kingdom that it was going to be a spiritual kingdom. Now, not everybody understood it. In fact, a lot of people didn't understand it while he was there. Even some of his apostles didn't quite understand it early on in his teaching. But he told them. He told them nonetheless. He preached that his kingdom was going to be a spiritual one. Yet the premillennialist claims that it hasn't come yet. Jesus failed to do that. Jesus did not fail to establish his kingdom. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, it says that as Christians, we have already been transferred into the kingdom. Well, if Jesus failed to establish the kingdom, how can we already be transferred into it? Ken made the point last week from Matthew 16:28 that Jesus said many of you whom he was speaking to would not taste death before the kingdom was established. So that means either the kingdom was established 2,000 years ago while he was here, or we've got some really old people walking around on the earth today who have not died because the kingdom's not here. The Bible makes it clear. Jesus makes it clear. His kingdom was established when he was here the first time, 2,000 years ago. And on top of that, to the point that was made a minute ago, how can we teach that Jesus failed? How can we teach that God's plan failed? Why would we want to serve a God who is able to be stopped by men, whose plan is able to be prevented by man? That's insulting to God. That's an insult to Jesus. We should not be okay with people teaching that. Our God does not fail. Jesus, who is also God, does not fail. Our salvation depends and depended on the success of Jesus. So if Jesus is a failure, we have no hope. As I said last week, this doctrine falls apart on that idea. That saying that God's a failure, that Jesus is a failure, without talking about anything else, the doctrine's done. That cannot be true. That cannot be what this book of Revelation or the Bible is teaching. We know that it can't. We are going to continue talking about other things. I don't think we have to, but we are going to break down some other things. More on the idea that, they teach that Jesus failed to establish the kingdom. That implies that Jesus dying on the cross was not the intention. That was not the plan. Jesus was not supposed to die on the cross. Well, if that's the case, why all throughout our New Testament is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus given such significance? Why are those things talked about in light of salvation? If Jesus wasn't supposed to die, those things would not be connected to our salvation because that wasn't the plan. But we know it was the plan. Exactly. That's my next point. It was a plan long before Jesus even came. If you look back to the Old Testament and the prophecies that were in the Old Testament prophesied about the death of Jesus. God knew long before Jesus got here that he was going to die. Man didn't catch him off guard and surprisingly not like his son and kill him. God knew he was going to die. Jesus knew he was going to go to the cross. Comment. Exactly. Exactly, and that's a great reference to what I'm mentioning here, that the New Testament lays out that the death, the burial, the resurrection, those are all where our salvation comes from. Clearly, that was the plan. That's what brought about salvation. That's what brought about the kingdom of God. It was a part of the plan. And do we really think that Jesus didn't have the power to prevent man from stopping him? If Jesus wanted to do something, do you really think he couldn't do it? I mean, he was raising people from the dead. He couldn't stop himself from dying? It just contradicts what our Bible teaches, what the New Testament says about the kingdom, about Jesus' purpose here on earth, and the nature of who God and Jesus were. It just doesn't make sense. One comment before we go on. Yeah, there were times when he said it isn't time, and he went about making sure that it happened at the right time. When Jesus finally did die, he knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise. I see another hand over here. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. What Vincent said is there were people trying to make Jesus a king on earth at times during his life. They wanted him to be an earthly king, and he refused it. If that was the plan, if truly he wanted to reign on earth, he had plenty of opportunity to do so. But that wasn't the plan. The plan was for him to die. What happened was the intended purpose, and we can't ignore that fact. Some other things. We've got some missing information. And what I mean by that is as we look through all the things that are taught by this doctrine, there's some things taught in this doctrine that we can't find in Revelation or anywhere else in our Bible. Hugh mentioned some of that last week when we talked about the rapture. Well, where is it? If those things are truth, why can't I find it in my Bible? There's a lot taught in this doctrine as well as other doctrines that aren't found in our Bible. I just mentioned it, the rapture. Though they try to pull that concept from some places, that's not found in our Bible. The idea of the Antichrist, they teach, will fight in that great battle Armageddon at the end of time. That's not in our Bibles. There's a lot of details around that battle of Armageddon that they teach that I can't find. Doesn't talk about these things. And like we've already iterated so far, talking about the first plan that failed, so they say, well, I don't read anything about the plan failing. We don't read anything about that. And that's not at all a comprehensive list of things in this doctrine that are missing. But all throughout their teachings, there are things that we can't find in our Bible. How do we know that these things are truth if the Bible didn't give them to us? Where did they come from? It seems as if there were gaps. They tried from Revelation chapter 20 to teach this doctrine and build this doctrine, but there were some things that just didn't add up. So they filled in the gaps any way they could, it would seem. And that's what they did. That's why some of these things aren't found in our Bible, because they're not. They're not in there. Somebody had to add it to it. Somebody had to teach it separate from the Bible. It's odd how much people pull from the book of Revelation that's not really there. I mean, talk to anybody about the book and ask them where they're finding these things, and it's interesting that sometimes they can't tell you. If you ask people, I mean, I think that's a great question to start with. On this doctrine, any other doctrine, doesn't even have to be about the book of Revelation. When people are teaching things to you that don't quite sound right, ask them, where is that? Where did you read that? Where did you find that in your Bible? Because I want to see it. And a lot of the time, they're not going to be able to do it. And that becomes a problem. And sometimes those people don't even know that it's not in their Bible. They've just heard it, they've been taught it by other people, and they just accept it. But these doctrines, this one, the one we talked about last week, other ones, will fall apart when they're not founded on biblical principles, when they're founded on ideas that we cannot find in our Bibles. There's a lot of info missing, but we're not going to talk much more about that. The last thing I want to talk about is premillennialism breaking our keys. Okay, so you already know it. We've got 4 keys we've been talking about since week 1. Time frame, audience, background, and style. We have used these things to make sure we make right interpretation from the book. If any other doctrine out in the world breaks any one of these 4 things, it's not truth. It has to meet all 4 of these things. Premillennialism breaks all 4. The time frame, this one's obvious. Premillennialism is teaching about things that are 2,000 plus years past the writing of this book. John said these things would take place soon. It breaks our time frame. The things being discussed in this doctrine don't relate to the saints in Asia Minor, whom this book was written to. It breaks our audience. This doctrine is not talking about the Roman Empire. It's not talking about first century Christians, which the book says that's what's being written about. It breaks our background. And then style. This one's important. It definitely is breaking the key of the style. It's a complete misinterpretation of the book and the book's purpose. They're taking very literal teachings from this book. It teaches a literal 1,000-year reign, a literal 1,000-year binding of Satan. If you look through chapter 20, if you were to take chapter 20 as literally as possible, you'll get a lot of the teachings of premillennialism. That's where it comes from. That's what they're doing. They're taking these things very literally and ignoring the fact that John said the things of this book are signified. They're signs. They're symbols. They have a meaning behind them that will fit these other 3 things. Do you have any other comments about this before we move on? It's very possible. I mean, if you look at the structure of this doctrine and a lot of other doctrines, I mean, we mentioned it when we talked about Jehovah's Witness, how it almost seemed just funny that I think Stu mentioned it, that the doctrine was started in 1908, and then right after that is when the kingdom started. It was almost self-serving. It was a doctrine created to make them feel better. And premillennialism is the same way. I mean, we've got the end of time, and the end of time, really, righteous people are going to go to heaven, unrighteous are going to go to hell. Well, that doesn't sound great. And so we've created this idea of the rapture, where God's people will be taken up. Everyone else will be left behind, not in hell, but they'll have an opportunity to sort out their life and get straight with God, because God's loving, and He's going to give people a chance. And obviously there's a lot more to that doctrine, but I think there's definitely some aspect of that which is true. When these doctrines are thought up, and whenever they were started and created, it's very likely that men were serving themselves. Some of them may have been sincere. I'm not trying to neglect that. But it does seem that some of these doctrines are almost too good to be true in some of those circumstances. Last comment.
Comforting, but we know it can't contradict clearly, and God said it's appointed unto you once to die.
Yeah.
You don't get another chance.
Yeah, so whatever these doctrines are, as self-serving as people want to be, they've ignored the fact that they've contradicted the rest of the Bible, which is a huge problem. We're going to go ahead and move on and wrap up that discussion. What I want to do for just a quick second, if you have anything, we've reached the end. I mean, this is the last class. So I told you a couple weeks ago I wanted people to come up with questions, things we would talk about week one. I didn't get much, a little bit that we'll talk about here in a minute. But if you've got any final questions or comments about the books, things that you've found interesting, things that have stood out to you, feel free to throw those out. Questions about, hey, what did that symbol in that chapter mean? What was this chapter about? Quick things. We can cover some of those things. If not, just stare at me blankly like you normally do. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and that's really why I didn't come up with these keys. Somebody who taught me the book did. But these keys are not given here because they're exclusive to Revelation. They're exclusive. They're given here because they help make right interpretation. And Hugh's right. It's not just Revelation. We have things, these 4 things or other things that are similar to help us understand. We take the same approach to any other book that we read outside of the Bible, in the Bible. But people don't seem to take that right approach when they get to Revelation, which is why we've emphasized them as much as we have, because most people would agree you have to approach a book, learn who wrote it, learn where it's written. But then for some reason people get to this book and throw all that out the window and don't seem to hold true to those things. Any other comments or anything?
Suppose a lot, we speculate. We like to fit our own ideas into things rather than recognizing the scriptures were there. Because God saw that it was good for man's own good. But He wrote it from His justification. Whether you like it or not, that's not going to make a difference breaks, that's two different things right there.
Yeah. Yeah, we have to make ourselves and our lives fit within the scope of what God says, the confines of what the limits God has placed. We can't build the limits and the rules based on our lives and the way we want them to be or the way we feel comfortable with them. Did somebody else have something?
God's word is power. Shakespeare's word is not power.
Correct. Yeah. These are words from our Creator. They must be treated that way and recognized where they're coming from. Any other final comments before we move on? I understand it's a broad opening, letting you talk about anything right now. You may not have much to say. Just wanted to make sure everybody had an opportunity to voice anything they wanted.
Well, I'll not step back.
Okay. We'll let you throw one more in, and we're going to move on.
Revelation is one of the most, well, like you correctly pointed out, we can abuse scripture just from Genesis to Revelation. It's just fascinating how, I mean, so many religious Christian denominations hold on to ideas out of Revelation, and they take it in isolation, not and then we start extrapolating all these things, and I find what is most surprising is even when you go into that with someone that you've seen it all wrong, trying to explain, all the evidence is plain and clear. We're choosing to reject things, sometimes on emotion. I'm just going to believe it. I didn't ask you if you believe it or not. I just told you, it's like, well, here's the evidence. It's like telling me, well, this earthquake never happened. There is the evidence. And we choose to hang on to things more than emotional stuff. We find that a lot out of Revelation. So we approach it. See emotions and stuff like that, or whatever we taught to just hang on to these things and try and carry it through our prayer book, regardless of whether it fits the book or not. Just don't carry it on. And that's a sad misuse of the book of Revelation.
Amen.
I don't know if this has been your experience or other people's experiences, but my experience in teaching Revelation to those that are asked to learn from the book, as they either became a new Christian or before they're Christian, they wanted to study this, they wanted to get the question answered. I think what I really have to prepare for is the reaction, because so much of it doesn't match what they thought they did, and they get emotional and they feel as though they've been lied to, and they get kind of angry that how could they teach me something like this? And so I want to get your advice or other people's opinions. I think that I have to prepare myself to help them through that, process, and make sure that don't get discouraged by it either. That we're just, I remember two people in particular, I have all these books, and I have all this stuff, and all these are wrong, all this is lies, or, we're just trying to cover what the Bible teaches on it, and it really kind of took one back. It took a few weeks just to get over it.
Yeah.
It's tough. We have to understand we're helping someone do something that they've always believed.
Yeah.
It's tough. It's not easy for them to accept something different.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I've had conversations very similar to that with people where you're teaching them something from the Bible that you know is truth that they've never heard and is in complete contrast to what they've heard. And we talked about it last week. It's sometimes easy for us to maybe make light of some of the things that we talked about or judge some of the things. We see very clearly what the truth is at times. Those people don't. I mean, some of those people have lived their entire lives learning those things, believing those things, building their life around some of those teachings. I mean, it's very deeply interwoven into their lives the same way that Christianity is to us. And they have false things. So when we start making those people aware of the truth and of the fault in the things that they believe and the things that they're following, it can be devastating. So I think that's a good point and a great thing to bring out, especially if we take this class and start sharing it with people. is be prepared for a reaction from people that they believe something very different. I mean, what they believe from Revelation is the foundation of the rest of their lives, how their life will play out at the end of time, how they will receive the reward from God that they believe is coming. And that's a big deal to people. It's not something to be taken lightly, and it's not something that's going to be easy to share with people or break to people. Just be prepared. It's a great point. I'm going to go ahead and move on so I can cover this last thing, because I have gotten some questions about it. I've had a couple different comments from people and questions that brought about this question, but a lot of people are wanting to know what really happened to Rome. So we've talked about from the book's perspective. We've talked about from a biblical perspective what God was doing to Rome, how God was bringing judgment, why God was bringing judgment. But if we look back through history, in our history books don't mention God. Our history books don't tell us God ended the Roman Empire. That's not how the world sees it. It would appear from the world's perspective that God was not involved. Obviously, we know that that's not true. God was responsible, but it's not always apparent to see how and to see exactly what happened to the Roman Empire. I want to show you the last portion of our class tonight, some historical causes for the Roman Empire, the demise of the Roman Empire. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the historical account of what happened to Rome, why Rome fell, and we're going to compare it to Revelation and see the two line up. The historical account doesn't contradict Revelation. Revelation doesn't contradict the historical account. The two actually coincide very well. Just one note of caution before I start. As I give some historical reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire, I am not saying 100% without a doubt God did every single one of these things or God's hand was on every single one of these things. I'm not God. Never spoken to God. So I can't say with confidence that I know exactly what he did, but the approach to this study is this. We know God's responsible. We know Rome fell. So if we look at why Rome fell, it's very likely that God was behind much of those things, which is the approach that we're going to take. Yeah, there's a lot of different empires throughout history that maybe this same study could apply to. We're looking specifically at the Roman Empire and things that have happened to the Roman Empire. What caused the fall of the Roman Empire? So I'm going to give you a couple things. These are the things that scholars and historians will most attribute to be the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire. So obviously there may be a lot more, but these are the big ones. These are the important ones. First one. Invasion by foreign nations. One of the most commonly accepted leading causes for the Roman Empire's demise is attacks from foreign nations. You have Germanic and barbarian groups like the Goths or the Huns. If you ever heard Attila the Hun, that's the group we're talking about, the Huns, as well as more formally organized nations such as the Parthians. The Parthian Empire was a big one at that time in the 1st century. As we get towards the end of the 1st century, early in the 2nd century, so very shortly after the writing of the book of Revelation, other nations began to gain traction in the world. They began to stand up to Rome. There are now, at this point in history, other viable nations at play, so why should Rome have all the power? It's the way a lot of people looked at it. These other nations began attacking Rome, the outskirts of the empire, making it smaller, taking what they could to be their own. It's not hard to see that this is something God could use to carry out his will. In what capacity, I'm not entirely sure, but all throughout history, God has allowed nations to rise. God has caused the fall of nations. He has used nations to destroy other nations. He used his nation of Israel to destroy other nations. He used other nations to bring Israel to their knees when they were not faithful. This is something God has done historically that we've seen. So it's not hard to see that here in the book of Revelation, this is definitely something God could use to his advantage, other nations, to take down a larger nation. And we see this in the book of Revelation. If you'll remember our discussion of the trumpets, God was giving Rome warnings, signs to get their attention, to encourage them to repent. The sixth trumpet, if you'll remember that, mentioned the Euphrates. We talked about how, let me say this. In that trumpet, it mentions the Euphrates, and that these angels at the bounds of the Euphrates were released. When these angels were released, a third of mankind was destroyed. Their armies numbered 200 million. We talked about how this idea symbolized attacks from foreign nations. The mention of the Euphrates was important in that discussion, because on the other side of the Euphrates from Rome was the Parthian Empire. The Euphrates split the Roman Empire to the Parthian Empire. So talking about the other side was a reference maybe to the Parthian Empire or any enemy of the Roman Empire. But that's the idea that was being talked about. The Parthians, like I said a minute ago, were another prominent empire of the time. They weren't as powerful as the Roman Empire in the first century, but the two didn't get along. Those two empires were always at each other, fighting each other, invading each other, taking things that belonged to the other. So this reference in Revelation is important because it's alluding to these enemies of the empire that could be used to weaken them, to hurt them. The Euphrates was mentioned again when we talked about the 6 bowls as well. So it was in the trumpets, it was in the bowls. These other nations could be used as both warnings for repentance. They could be used as destructive judgment. It's something we see in the book of Revelation. And that's exactly what happened. Historians will tell you one of the main reasons for Rome's demise was attacks from other nations, from outside, attacking them and bringing them down. Again, being one of the largest, it's not hard to see how that fits into Revelation. We've had mentionings of that. We've seen that in the book as being something God could use to bring down nations that opposed him. The second one, economic hardships and overexpansion. And I'll explain what all this means. This kind of encompasses a lot of different things, so I've kind of grouped a lot of things into one here. But as we look at this, if we're thinking about the Roman Empire, one of the main problems they had was war expense. If you're constantly getting attacked by other nations, you're constantly at battle. If you're constantly trying to expand your nation, you're out at battle. And war was expensive. Rome wanted power, so they had to pay for it. In order to pay for war and for battle, oppressive taxes were brought down on their people. Because of these very oppressive taxes, it widened the gap between the rich and the poor, and it resulted in many people leaving Rome. The people of Rome felt as if they were paying and they were funding Rome's war venture. They didn't want to do that, so they left. Rome didn't have the taxpayers that they need. They couldn't fund their expenses. Because of that, they were driving away more of their taxpayers. And with that came a labor deficit. What I mean by that, their people are leaving. There's nobody left in the empire to work, to be employed by the empire. There were fewer people left in Rome. This diminished the number of people who were willing to work. It diminished the number of people who were willing to fight. The once envied army of Rome was dwindling. They weren't quite as powerful by mid to end 2nd century. The Empire of Rome. Yeah, let me specify. We're talking about the Empire of Rome. So that expands much outside of Rome. It goes further up into Europe, down to the northern tip of Africa, over to modern-day Turkey, is really where they were founded, where their territory was, but they had reach way outside of that. They reached the entire world, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. But like we said, the war expense, people were having to pay it themselves. They didn't like it, so they left. There weren't enough people to work anymore or to pay their taxes. So Rome is running out of money. They're running out of people. They already were, but at this time, Rome became more reliant on slave labor. people that they conquered in these battles, territories that they took, those people became slaves to Rome. But you have to realize that creates a cycle. Rome needed money to conquer people, but they needed the people to go out and conquer more people. It's this endless cycle, and Rome over time just ran out of resources, money and people. They're running out. It's dwindling down. Because of that, they had reduced trade outreach. So this gets to your point. Rome reached the entire world through trade. They had many roads. We talked about the Silk Road going through Smyrna and some of the other cities. Rome was very powerful because of how far they could reach and how much trade they could do around the world. But as you start losing people, as you start being attacked by other nations, trade wasn't as easy anymore. They couldn't reach the rest of the world. They couldn't keep that power going. Much of their roads and much of the shipping channels that they used for trade were taken over by pirates. North African pirates took over that area. They couldn't travel as much for trade. They couldn't reach the places that they needed to. So over the 2nd century, they lost Northern Europe. They lost Eastern Asia. Their area of reach started shrinking because they couldn't do the things they needed. They didn't have what they needed. Limited resources made it very difficult to continue building such a large empire. The book of Revelation talks about these things. These things are not outside the realm of Revelation. We've talked about economic hardships throughout the book, through all the trumpets, the warnings that were given to Rome, through the bowls when judgment was being brought out. We talked about difficulty, the economy breaking down. We talked about some of those things. If you'll remember, both the trumpets and especially the bowls, when those were poured out, some of the main people that were focused on were merchants and merchant ships and people associated with those things. If you go back and read the bowls, you'll see some of those things. The economy was being very heavily affected by what God was doing. The economy was breaking down. Those things that we saw in Revelation with the ships and the ship merchants were alluding to this economic difficulty and the culture and the economy breaking down around the people. And do you remember in the book of Revelation how people reacted to it? They were mourning. All of the ship's merchants, all of the salesmen of the time were all very sad. We saw them mourning, crying out, but it wasn't because they were sad that Rome was going away. They were upset for themselves. Those merchants and those ship owners were sad because they were being directly affected now that Rome was going away. They weren't happy with Rome. They were no longer in support of that empire that didn't benefit them anymore. That's what Revelation said would happen, and that's exactly what happened. The economy started breaking down in Rome because of poor choices by a lot of people, and people started leaving. People were mourning that they were being affected by this economic breakdown, and they were leaving. They were abandoning that empire because that empire did not have the power it once had. Which brings me to the next point here. Scattered and ineffective leadership. The leaders, because it was getting so big, the leaders could not keep control of it. Becoming the emperor of Rome became a death sentence in the second century. If you became the emperor, you were probably going to be murdered because everybody started hating the Roman Empire, hating the leaders. People gave up hope, and people abandoned the empire. The head of the empire was cut off. We saw that in Revelation. The sea beast, the earth beast, was cut down. They were destroyed. The power of the headship of the empire was destroyed. That's what we saw in the book. That's what happened. People gave up hope in their leaders. Leaders fell apart. The empire collapsed from top to bottom. The immorality could not ride on the back of the empire anymore. The harlot couldn't ride on the back of the sea beast. Do you remember that? We talked about that. The empire fell apart. The last one's important, so I'm going to cover it real quick. Christianity. Christianity started growing in the world.
it started spreading. People started buying into it. This idea of one God who was not a man spread. People bought into it. People lost faith in the empire that was supporting many gods, that was supporting this man as God. Scholars will disagree about how heavily Christianity was in the demise of the Roman Empire, but it definitely played a big part. Christians were victorious. That was the message of the book. That was ultimately one of the reasons that Rome fell, because people bought into Christianity. People bought into the one true God as opposed to this empire. It's a great wrap-up. That was the message of the book. The saints would be victorious. The Roman Empire would fall. And that's exactly what happened. Because God was with his people, and God took care of his people. That brings us to the end of the class. If you've got other questions or comments you'd like to talk to me about, feel free. I'll talk to anybody that wants to talk to me about it. Thanks for listening. I've enjoyed it. So thanks for being a part of it.